Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chris Woolsey from Business Review, and I'll be your host. It's our pleasure to have Prism ID with us today, who will be discussing Intuitive Surgical and Prism ID, integrating labeling with SAP for label content integrity and control. Today's guest speakers are Gian Argawal, Senior Program Manager, Digital Engagement, and Chris Lentz, VP of SAP Business Development at Prism ID. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar platform on 24. You will notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link that you received via email to rejoin the session. In order to ask questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top left-hand corner of your screen and click submit. We will allocate some time at the end of the session to address any questions or thoughts that you may have. Please use the help widget if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize, and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. There is also a survey that you can fill out at any time. It's located at the bottom of your screen with the other widgets. But now please allow me to welcome Chris. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the introductions. I just wanted to briefly run through the agenda. We'll take a look first at SAP and Prism ID. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I'd also like to add my welcome to you all for joining us today. We're going to then look at some of the ideas around benefiting from integrating your labeling system into your SAP environment, and look at SAP and Prism 360 together in the wider application landscape. We'll take a look at a couple of ROI examples towards the end, and then finish off with a Q&A session, as Chris has mentioned. Speakers today, obviously, you've just been introduced to by Chris, so I'll go straight through and start the core of the session. I wanted to start by looking at Prism ID's relationship with SAP, and also the ecosystem of partners and specialists that we work with within that environment. Prism ID is a leading provider of enterprise-class data-driven label lifecycle management solutions, and we do have customers across a number of sectors, but we do have a very specific focus on the needs of the life sciences industry, and it is for our expertise in this area that we are best known. For many years, we've been helping some of the world's largest medical device and pharmaceutical businesses to manage their product labels and associated data in a way that helps them to maintain compliance and validation with the strictest of regulatory requirements, for example, for the FDA or the EU. With compliance demands getting tighter, labeling today, of course, is not simply a case of printing a few pieces of product information onto adhesive labels. It's about that data and making sure that data is correct, reducing risk of product recalls and ensuring traceability, compliance, and all of those other aspects that you're all very familiar with. Many of our customers need to access production data from their SAP ERP systems, and they need to use that data on their product labels. Sometimes the data from SAP is just used as it is from the SAP environment. In other scenarios, you might need to manipulate the data, change the data, make some calculations, for example, calculating the expiry date based on a production date and so on. Regardless of how the data is used, customers need assurance that the information that accompanies the finished goods on the labels is synchronized with the SAP or other business application data. To this end, Prism ID is committed to supporting our customers that rely on SAP and the critical data it holds. We invest in membership of the SAP partner and certification programs and work very closely with leading SAP systems integrators specializing in the life sciences sector. Working with these organizations, we can ensure successful implementation of end-to-end label management projects that meet the complex requirements of our customers, often reaching way beyond the labeling solution itself. By providing reliable integration with SAP and other systems, Prism ID solutions enable a data-driven approach to be implemented for the management of production labels, and we'll hear some more about this data-driven approach as we go through the presentations. This approach moves the emphasis away from a simplistic one label format per product platform to one where the label format becomes a template or a bucket into which the correct data is dynamically deposited at the appropriate time as part of the printing process. This allows management overheads to be reduced, processes to be streamlined, and enables more automation, ensuring consistency and data integrity. As I said, we'll hear more about that as we go through the presentation. Before we get into the meat of this session, in time-honoured webinar tradition, let's kick off with a quick poll. The main discussion today is around looking at ways that integration of systems such as SAP into the labelling platform can ensure that the correct data is used at the correct time, in particular when synchronizing label printing with manufacturing and production. We can take a quick look at the following common challenges that you can see on the screen in front of you. We often find our customers citing these as issues when synchronizing label data with other systems. If you can click on any of them that apply to you as a significant challenge in your environment, we'll just take a few moments to gather the results and see what we find. So the first one is, do you have issues, or is ensuring compliance being maintained at all times is an issue? Is there a lack of a consistent approach for printing labels across multiple production lines? Are you lacking real-time integration with SAP, PLM, or maybe other business applications? A lack of single centralized label management systems. There may be others. If you do have other challenges as well, they're not included in the list. Just tick the box. Unfortunately, we can't provide a way for you to elaborate on them. But you could just take a few moments to select any that apply in your environment. Again, ensuring compliance. Is that a challenge? Is there a lack of consistency across different production lines? Do you lack in real-time integration between business applications and the labelling platform? The lack of a single centralized management system, or any other issues that you might have. Chris, how are we doing with the responses? Okay, good. So thank you very much for taking that time. So it looks like a large number of you are consistency seems to be, or lack of consistency is a fairly common theme, and a lack of a single centralized management system is clearly the biggest challenge there. But significantly, yes, all of those seem to be something that are a challenge to all of you. So thank you very much for that, and just a few others as well. So perhaps we can follow up and find out what those are at a later date. So having taken part in the survey, I'd now like to hand over to Gian Agarwal, who's the Senior Program Manager for Digital Engagement and Intuitive Surgical. He's kindly agreed to share his thoughts around how these challenges can be met, and to consider some of the benefits that integrating data across SAP and wider application landscape can deliver. So I'll hand over control to you, Gian.
Thank you, Chris. Just before we start, the opinion and the views expressed in this webinar presently belongs to me, solely to me, and not necessarily of my employer. And I was fortunate to be a part of this implementation, so I would share some of my insights and what we learned and what possibly can be done better. So doesn't it look all simple? You manufacture the product, you put a label, you package your stuff, ship it to your warehouse or to your distribution center, and reaches to your customer. Now, what is the key thing which actually connects the product from your customer all the way back to your vendor when you start manufacturing your product? Labeling. Labeling is such an important aspect of today's supply chain that it connects the product right from the manufacturing to the distribution to get back to your customer. And as the supply chain is growing, as you scale your operations and distribution across different continents, having a labeling system which is coming up to speed with the changing supply chain is very equally important. We invest a lot of time and money in developing all the other supply chain systems across it, but the labeling system is sometimes ignored. But looking at the importance of labeling across the supply chain, it is imperative that we look at this holistically and what can we do to connect the manufacturer all the way to the customers, and also make sure that when you're scaling your operations, you're able to scale along with that. So with that said, this is what we had in our mind when we actually went along with this process of upgrading our labeling system. So just to give you a little bit of context around the manufacturing process of what we had currently, we had a pretty much a decentralized system and a system which was printing labels on manually. When I say manually, means that a lot of human intervention was involved. Folks were inputting data into an Excel sheet and maintaining it at a central repository, and it was getting printed. Giving you a little bit of context, what exactly the systems were involved while printing, on the shop floor, we had our own developed legacy system and an ERP system, which was SAP, and a PLM system, which stores the product master data. So all these three systems were playing a part in actually printing a label. And a key thing out here to notice that we do not print batch labels in the sense that we do not print all the labels at one time. What we do is, as the product moves from one manufacturing cell to the other as it gets manufactured, at a certain step in the BOM, when a printing is required, it makes sure that all the parameters are validated. And then at that point of time, the front end, which is on the shop floor system, is responsible for triggering the print. And in the background, it collects the data from different Excel and different places and then prints the label. So more or less like a just-in-time printing in the sense where the label is printed at the runtime. So that's what if you look at the process, and this process could be scaled to job order process manufacturing, any kind of manufacturing. But the whole idea is just to want to give you a little bit of context to understand what exactly is happening behind the scene when a demand for a print or a demand for a label is executed. So with that in mind, what were the labeling challenges which basically prompted us to do this? The biggest one, which basically comes as we talked about, the supply chain becomes larger across different part of the world, where you're expanding your operations, you're expanding your markets. You need to be in compliance with the regulatory bodies of that particular country. And as you scale your operations, those labels need to be compliant, otherwise you would be subject to audits and you will always have a problem. Again, as the supply chain is expanding, you have different factories across the world. You're manufacturing products somewhere, you're distributing it some other part of the world. You need to have a consistent approach. How can you print the labels? And so that if there is an audit or if there is a possibility of looking back at what exactly went wrong across the supply chain, since you have a consistent approach to doing things, you would always be able to trace back. So having a consistent approach, being compliant, was one of the key aspects of this implementation. And as we talked about just-in-time label printing, where the label is being printed at the runtime, we needed data from different sources. And the complexity arises from the fact that some of the data was sitting in SAP, some of the data was sitting in the PLM system, and some of was in the Excel files outside these systems. So how do you bring all this together so that you can have a label which is tightly integrated and also you can print records at the runtime? And the last one, which was the designing and the printing process, is disjointed. So they worked well, but they were disjointed in the sense you do not have a central repository or a central place, but all these labels were designed. The labels were designed by a certain department, and then it was being printed on the manufacturing floor, but there was no way of communicating that. And what it lacks is that every time you make a change to a label, you had to create a new label template. So it means that you had an n number of label templates corresponding to n number of parts, rather than having a consolidated, normalized certain set of label templates, but you're having multiple. So these were the major challenges, or I would say the mission statement we were trying to work towards to solve our labeling problem. Looking at this screen, this basically is, as we talked about, what are the different systems which are playing a part into this thing. And we are looking at a PLM system, a Prism 360 system, a PCS, and an SAP system. And when I say PCS, it's a homegrown system which is being used on the shop floor to print labels as well as for all the other manufacturing process. So printing was just one aspect to it. Now, the process is, as we talked about, is two-step process. The one is the designing of the labels, and the second portion is the printing of the labels. Now, when I designing of the labels, as we talked about that, the current process was that the labels were one-to-one, in a one-to-one correspondence, means that every time you design a label template, it was associated with one single part. You could not link it to multiple parts. So as we said, that was a problem statement. So with this implementation in mind, we had the label design team would design the labels, normalize the labels, and design one template which could be used across multiple product lines or product groups. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that down the slide, what it looks like and how it does. But just to kind of talk to you through about the process of the change order process. So in a change order, so basically on the left-hand side of the screen where the PLM system and the Prism 360 system is involved, that's basically is the designing process where the label is designed which could cater to the requirements of the printing department. So in the first case, when you create a change order, it means that every time a request comes in for a change or a creation of a new label, it was initiated in the PLM system. And this could be from engineers or could be from anybody, but if a new product is getting launched or if a new label is required for certain purposes, a request was created in the PLM system. And all the attributes, all the master data, and the data required on the labels was put on the PLM system. And as we can see that the first step was to create the change order. Now the change order, once it was created, the data was sent to the Prism 360 system. And that's step number 2, which is responsible through a live API call was sent to the Prism 360 system. Prism 360 system took that data and internally collaborated with the different people, the designers, to make sure that they have all the elements required to design a label and design a template. And at this point of time, they're designing the template and collaborating with all the team members and others to make sure the output which is coming out meets the requirement. Also at this point of time, because once you design a template, you need to show how exactly the template would look like when it's populated with the real-time data. So Prism 360 used to make a call to the Agile system to fetch some master data, so to fetch some dummy data. And that dummy data was supposed to populate that template to show exactly how the picture looks like. And then they create a PDF. Once the PDF is created, Prism 360 sends the final PDF back to the PLM system against the same change order number. That's basically a cycle. And once the change order gets received back in the PLM system, they've completed the cycle. Now they have the product attributes, part master data, as well as they have the label, how it finally looks like. And within the Agile system, there are different set of approvers, different set of, all the approval process used to is taking place in PLM system. And once it's approved in the PLM system, command is sent from the PLM system back to the Prism 360 system saying that the data, the label template, what you have used to design this label is approved, and this is ready for printing. What it means is that the template which was early in a non-production stage or in a non-production status is now ready for printing, because unless the PLM system does not send a command for that this is ready for printing, you would not be able to use that template for printing on the shop floor. So that's the kind of a control we develop. Now, that's basically the designing piece. Now, moving on to the right-hand side of the screen, which is basically the printing part. And the printing part is, as we talked about earlier, there are 3 systems which are involved, the production control system, the ERP, the SAP system, and the Prism 360 system. Once the product is ready to be manufactured, whether it's a work order, process order, or whatever order, the order is created in SAP, and that becomes the input to the PCS system. PCS system says, okay, this order is ready to be printed. What needs to be printed? It scans the work order and sends the command to the ERP system saying that a print request has been created and we want to print the label for a following product. ERP system, which is SAP in this case, takes the request from the PCS system and collects all the transactional data which is in the ERP system and sends it to the Prism 360 systems to say, we want to print the following label with the following attributes. And the attributes could be your part number, quantity, expiration date, manufacturing place, all that kind of good stuff is available in the ERP system. And Prism 360, at this point of time, gathers all the data, and uses the template, the data-driven templates, and prints to a printer which is on the network. Once it's printed, PCS system queries back to the Prism 360 to check whether the print has been completed successfully or not. If it has been successfully, it closes the transaction at its end, and then the printer or the lineman probably looks at the label to make sure that the label is correct, it meets all the requirements, and before it's put it onto the product. So that's basically the whole of printing process is there, and it's how tightly it's integrated to one central system, which is the Prism 360 system in this case. And the data flow is happening between all the three different systems, but it's producing the label at the runtime. Now, this is basically, if you look at holistically, the design process and the printing process. But there will always be a chances that you might have to modify the label, or you might have to change the label, or you might have to add some content to the label. And you might don't have to change the whole label template, but you just might have. You will follow the same process what's there on the left-hand screen. You create a new change order. This is for updating an existing label, and data is passed from PLM system to the Prism 360 into collaboration approval process within the Prism 360, and before it sends to the PLM for final approval. Once it's ready, it's approved in the PLM, signaled back to Prism 360 system saying that this template has been updated and it's ready for, with a new version, it's ready for printing on the shop floor. Now, the shop floor, when it creates a work order, it makes sure it pulls the latest version of it in their structure. And once a command is sent, Prism 360 knows that they have to use this. So this basically keeps both the system, both the aspect of designing as well as the label printing in check, and it keeps the data integrated and able to print the label on the runtime. Just to give you a little bit of a perspective of what exactly is the data-driven label. One thing I just want on a previous slide, all that process, just going back to the process, if you look at the process, all the process on the right-hand side where you saw the Prism 360, there was, it was totally unattended in the sense that the users were interacting with the PCS system. And in the background, the Prism 360 system was gathering all the data and printing it. So this, at no point in the printing process, a user is interacting with the Prism 360. So that's what we have as an unattended printing. So we use the concept of unattended printing in this case. Coming back to this slide, just talking about a little bit about what exactly is the concept of data-driven labels. If you look at this, a label, it's a typical label which has got the product name, which has got the where it was manufactured, it has got the expiry date, and so these different elements, if you look at it, are coming from different places. So looking at this, what's there in the blue box is all coming from an SAP system, which is basically the dynamic data, the UDI or the lot number, what is the quantity of that part, and what is the expiry date or the serial number, whatever the case might be. That's all coming from the SAP system. Looking at the master data. Master data is like the product name, the description and whatnot. It's all coming from the PLM system. That's what it stores. And the key thing which out here is about the data-driven label, which I'm going to delve into the details of that a little bit on the slide, is the attributes, because these attributes, where are they coming from? These attributes are part of the PLM system. And just to give you an example, let's look at this example. Let's say you have a manufacturing facility in Asia and in the US. Now, you're manufacturing the same product across 2 different continents. And as when you're printing the label, you want that if a part is being manufactured in Asia, it should print the Asia address, or if you're printing it in US, it should print the US address. What happens in these templates, when you're designing this template, the address section of the template is more or less becomes a variable. And when you design your template, you put a logic in the template itself saying that if the data contains the following string, then that's what the address you need to put. If it is from Asia, that is what the address you need to put in. So what happens is that you have one template which is catering to the 2 different production lines. And when at the runtime, when whether it's SAP or your PLM system or any other ERP system sends the data, where is it being manufactured, the label template in Prism 360 makes that decision and prints that particular address. So that way you have created a single template which could cater the needs for multiple plants. Same way for the model. Now, you have a model 1, 2, and 3, different models which you might be manufacturing. And this is being driven by the product attributes which are stored in the Agile system or in your PLM system, whatever the case might be. And if the label is being printed for a model A or a model 1, those data elements are sent from the PLM system to Prism 360 to make a decision that a checkbox needs to be against a model 1 versus a model 2. Now, again, the same thing. It's a data-driven label concept where you have a label template which can cater to the requirements of all these different product groups and product lines with the fact that the size of the label will remain the same, data elements remains the same, you would be able to control all these things. As a matter of fact, you could look at the symbols also. Those symbols probably could be controlled as part of data. If a part is sterilized versus non-sterilized, what kind of sterility it has, all that good stuff can be controlled through data-driven label. So that basically gives you an insight how all the data, which is residing in 2 different continents, different places, and how one template, which is being driven by data, can cater to the requirements for all the 3 systems in this case. Now, we talked about data-driven labels. We talked about the labeling challenges. And when we did this implementation, we had this idea that this is what we would get the benefits out of that. And as we talked about that we have a centralized place where we can design all the templates, we have normalized all the different templates, which makes it easier for the users to make the changes, to make the edits, as well as for the traceability purposes. So if you want to look for a particular icon and say which are the different label, if I'm changing an icon, what are the different label templates which are impacted or which are the labels which are impacted, you could literally just look in the minutes based on a certain reports which you can run in the system and say, where exactly is this being used? So it basically saves time. And then when you have one central place and you modularize the design, it just makes much easier for everybody to do a change control and to manage the different versions within the system. And we talked about having folks entering data manually. With this process, it's tightly integrated. There is no manual intervention of the users other than sending a command to print, which makes it chances of any human error is eliminated, virtually eliminated. But as things get a little more matured and progress, you put controls around that to even kind of eliminate any kind of human error which could potentially come out of this. And obviously, the FDA and the compliance is one of the biggest things to make sure that when they ask for a label, when they ask for an instance, say, how did you print this label? What was the content going in? You have one place where you can actually fetch all the records to say which template was used, what was the source of the data, from where it was coming, and what was the actual instance of label instance which was printed. All can be fetched in once from a central place. That gives you the flexibility as well as from and you can look back from a traceability as well as from an audit point of view, when it was printed, how it was printed. So makes you much more compliant to make sure that you have everything in place. And obviously the biggest one was that it allows you to grow, as we talked about, as your supply chain expands to different part of the world and the different countries. It lets you have the scalability option that you could use the same set of labels and scale it to different countries by adding certain logic parameters within the same template. So those are the benefits of the integration, what we perceive as part of this implementation. And obviously, while going through this journey, there were a lot of learnings and a lot of consideration you have to keep in mind in order to do such a complex implementation. The biggest one was that when you have a variety of product groups and product lines, the data, and we talked about the data-driven labels, all these labels which are driven by data, you don't find a single place where all these data elements are stored. They are stored at all over the place. And all these different elements which are driving the data-driven labels are not controlled by or not owned by one team, one department, because you could have a manufacturing, you could have engineering, you could have marketing holding certain side of things. So how to collate all that data, put it together, and make them understand the importance of putting these attributes in the system at one place was a big challenge. People to understand the importance of the data-driven label, people to understand what exactly it entails, how if you change an attribute, how it will impact the downstream. That's something which was quite a bit of a task to come up to putting the data together and making people understand that. That was a big consideration when we did this. The change management, as we talked about, that it was a manual process. Getting from a manual process to a data-driven label concept and understanding how the label templates have become so intelligent, and you can use one label template across a product group or a product line. You don't have to create a new label every time a new product or a new version is created. To educate and to folks to kind of understand the holistic concept behind it and across the team was something to be managed. And the biggest of all was the integration with different systems. Now, in this case, you have a homegrown system, you have an SAP system, and you have a PLM system. All these three different systems have a different platform. How do you make sure that they integrate and they're able to print and able to give you what you want at the runtime without any hiccups was a big challenge. Keep in mind that the printing is a part of the manufacturing process. So, and as we talked about, these are just-in-time data-driven labels. So if a data element is not available or for some reason the interactions between the systems stops, you basically are not able to produce anything. You just cannot manufacture it. You cannot ship out anything, which basically impacts the revenue. So putting a technical solution, putting a solution which will integrate well with all the three systems and having a system available all the time, 24/7, because manufacturing lines can work 24/7 sometimes, to make sure that it was a big technical challenge. And the design needs to be robust, to be scaled up, was a big consideration and the whole scheme of things. Chris?
Thank you very much, Ian. That was really interesting. Very, very insightful comments, and hopefully it's given the folks in the audience some food for thought. I want to spend a few minutes now just on a high-level overview of Prism 360 itself. So Jian's described in a good amount of detail how their environment is set up, how all the integration is working. Let's just take a look in a little bit more detail at the Prism 360 part in the middle. Now, we're not going to go into every single feature and function of the product here. Just wanted to give you a quick overview of some of the main components. If we look at the diagram here, essentially we have the main components of the architecture sitting at the top and the kind of user frontline components sitting at the bottom. Prism 360 is built on a web-based architecture, and user access is via a standard web browser. The whole system is designed with compliance in mind, with control, auditability, obviously critical in that, and there are capabilities and features in there to help you do things like maintain the FDA closed system requirements and so on. The data itself, and by data we mean obviously the data that you're going to use on the labels that are associated with the labels. That could be data such as content for IFUs, the kinds of data that Jian has just been describing that come in from those external systems. That all sits in a database, SQL Server or Oracle. And for a lot of customers, the key thing as well around security is the ability to seamlessly apply their corporate security profiles. So if you want to integrate Active Directory or LDAP, you can do that. Prism 360 has its own very granular and tightly controlled security model for users and groups and so on, of course, permissions, what have you. But we find in a lot of cases customers will want to bring their own security policies into the environment. Towards the end here, we're showing the kinds of applications that the platform can interface with. Again, we've been hearing about examples of SAP, Agile. It could be a manufacturing execution system. It could be a homegrown production control system, as we've just heard. A number of different environments that you might be needing to connect to actually bring data across to make sure that the data on your labels is reflecting what you want to do. Now, the integration with those systems can be made in a number of different ways, depending on what the application is, what the relevant use case is. It could be as simple as a simple exchange of XML data, perhaps via a file drop, an automated file drop, or we might be using SOAP or RESTful web service APIs. It just depends on what the requirements are for the particular application that you want to integrate. Web services have been used to a large extent in the kind of integration that Jian was describing just now in his part of the presentation. In some cases, in the SAP case, for example, we've gone through a certification process with the application vendor to ensure that we're doing things in a way which are appropriate for their particular platform. Now, we see the main function of Prism 360 as managing data. The actual label, of course, is important, but it's just one of the many potential outputs. But printing is clearly a critical part of that process. So we support a wide range of printers, as you would expect. There are also a number of additional output capabilities. We can do things like generating PDF files. That might be, for example, for returning electronic record of a change into your master data record in the PLM system. The whole environment is scaled, designed to scale, so you can have a distributed platform enabling you to support the largest of requirements across a big, wide enterprise. I'd just like to say, incidentally, that if you can hear some background noise going on, our next-door neighbours have decided in the building next door that they're going to start digging up their car park, so if you can hear a pneumatic drill going on in the background, that's, I'm afraid, not much I can do about that, but that's what that noise is. Do apologise. Let's just take a look more at a slightly deeper level into the integration with SAP itself. Clearly, and as I'm sure you'll all appreciate, that SAP implementations are never the same. No two SAP implementations are alike. So what we've done with our SAP integration strategy is to build it around an approach that makes use of standard SAP tools and methods that enables these integrations to be implemented across a wide range of use cases. And this approach of using standard tools and standard configurations is very much endorsed by SAP themselves, of course, because they see that as a way to ensure there's a common set of integration methodologies used across all their different partner applications. As I've mentioned, the capability of web services central to our integration layer is the web service capability that Prism 360 provides. That enables the central labeling platform to be both a web service provider and a web service consumer. So you can get that kind of two-way integration going, that facilitating that kind of communication that, again, we saw earlier where, you know, data is being passed one way and then going the other way, you've got acknowledgement or you've got some other data passed back in the opposite direction. That's all facilitated by this web services layer. In the case of most modern SAP platforms, integration is possible in a number of ways, but central to a lot of them is the use of what SAP call the process integration or SAP PI component of SAP process orchestration, or PO. That's shown here in this little diagram. SAP PO is SAP's strategic platform for business process optimization, automation, and importantly for this discussion, integration between SAP and non-SAP applications. So they're moving away from what used to be a slightly more proprietary approach in SAP terms for how to talk to other platforms, and they're adopting a much more forward-thinking, open approach using this web services platform. And one of the integration approaches that we've gone through for certification is to certify through the process orchestration component. The integration we've done here uses standard SAP supplied components. So, for example, it uses the PI web services adapter, and that helps to ensure the onwards compatibility of the integration with future releases of SAP. So as SAP upgrades their platform, the PO platform goes with it. For example, if you're moving from ECC to S4HANA, then the integration that you've got in place will be able to be maintained as well. We can, of course, integrate with customized SAP environments. That's the beauty of web services, of course. So if, as is often the case, customers have implemented their interfaces into SAP through customized web service calls, then we can provide a route to get data using those as well. In this diagram at the bottom here, it's just to briefly go through what this is actually showing. It's an example here is integrating via PO, as I mentioned. But here we're talking about getting some work order data out of the SAP system and how that would work in this integration scenario. So just simplified here, what we're saying is that a user generates a work order. In SAP terminology, that work order will generate an IDOC or trigger an IDOC containing all the information about the work order, the contents of what the work order is going to provide. That's a standard IDOC in the case of this scenario. And what we're doing is passing the information in that IDOC through SAP PO into Prism 360. And SAP is doing that by making a call to a web service that Prism 360 is exposing to the SAP system. Now, as that data comes in, Prism 360 has the capacity to perform any kind of calculation, manipulation, or whatever filtering that you want to do on the data. So as the data comes through, Prism 360 can then map that data internally onto the relevant data tables within the Prism 360 environment, and obviously from there on it can be used in labels or on IFUs or wherever the data is intended to be used in the end. And again, as we saw in the example earlier, you can start doing things like passing acknowledgement and status information back. You can pass data back as well the other way, so that the necessary SAP users and systems can be updated accordingly. Now, what's interesting about this approach is there was no need to implement any custom ABAP coding on the SAP side. All it's needed is a bit of configuration in the PO environment. Having talked quite a lot about the integration capabilities and the benefits of integration, let's look at a couple of examples of how this can benefit organizations. The first example here is the impact of a single mass change event. This was actually, the data that we used for this was provided by a customer. When they were looking at implementing a Prism ID solution, they went through this process as part of their sales cycle. What they wanted to know was how much of a benefit it would be were they to use a Prism ID data-driven approach to managing this kind of change. So what they did first was they said, okay, let's look at what we do today. How do we actually implement a single change? And they found that there's an awful lot of, this is a big company, as you can see, they had a lot of labels, they had a lot of products. They worked out the amount of time the effort in terms of hours required to make this change. So it's going to be things like looking through all their labels to identify the ones they needed to change, generating PDFs of those labels, getting them reviewed, getting them approved, and so on. And you can see here a lot of hours spent doing this. This is purely based on the time to do the work. And the overall cost of that single change on a number of labels, in this case, they had to make changes to 3,000 of their 4,000 or so labels. And as you can see, there's over $352,000 worth of cost based on the amount of hours that were required. Now, when they plugged in the similar process against how it would be done in a Prism ID environment, what they realized, or what they found, was there's a significant saving doing it for the same number of labels, for exactly the same change, but because they could benefit by reducing hugely the amount of time taken to do some of these tasks, they were able to realize a significant cost, nearly $300,000 worth of savings in the cost of making that single change. Now that's an example of how that particular change event, how much it was costing the company. Now, what it's worth pointing out is that this comparison was done on the basis of them also adopting the same process before and after the change, but there could be more significant savings to be made if you start looking at that data-driven approach that Gian has just been describing. That can reduce even further the number of labels, the amount of overhead, the administration, maintenance, and so on. What I would say is irrespective of what labeling solution you're using, irrespective of whether you're considering changing it, this is definitely a worthwhile exercise to undergo, because quite often we find that customers don't realize how much it's costing them to make this sort of change. If we look at another example, in this example, what the customer did was implement a process that enabled them to remove IFUs from a small percentage of their product catalogue. So this is around languages. Instead of having to print large numbers of booklets in multiple languages catering for different markets, what they did was introduce a process whereby at the point of printing the labels, they also determined what languages were needed in the IFUs. So that helped this organization to reduce significantly by using a kind of just-in-time approach to printing those IFUs, reduce the number of booklets they had sat on the shelf and potentially becoming obsolete very quickly. And as you can see, again, realizing significant benefits both in terms of saved storage, saving space, and of course, reduction on overhead on the environment by saving wasted paper. So a couple of fairly significant examples how taking that kind of approach to managing your data can help in the environment. Now, before we move on to the summary slide, just a quick reminder, if you could remember to fill in the survey that Chris pointed out at the top of the webinar. I'd be very interested in your answers to those questions. So that's basically the end of the presentation part. Just to close off, this quick summary, we'd like to say that Prism 360 was developed for the life sciences industry by the life sciences industry. So what we mean by that is our focus is on, and experience in life sciences enables to provide the kind of research and development needed that we feel that our customers need. We work with our customers to develop the solutions. We deal with user groups and so on to help build the kind of solutions that these organizations need. Critical to overall that, of course, is the integration. So we talked a lot about integrating with SAP and other applications, and of course the requirement for data integrity, making sure that the data that you're using for your labels is consistent and correct at the point of use. Okay, so I think, Chris, that's the end of the main presentation piece. I think we now have time for some Q&A.
Yes, so thank you very much for the presentation. Just a reminder for the audience, in order to ask questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top left-hand corner of your screen and click submit. We have had a few questions come in during the webinar, so I'll just jump right in with this one, which is, why did you choose to approve the labels in the PLM system and not in the labeling system? Who would like to answer that one?
I think that's probably one for... Yeah.
Sure. This is a question which always will come in mind, is why did we choose that when Prism 360 had its own collaboration? So the basic reason was that it's a complex industry, and the manufacturing process requires not just the labels, there were other integral components which are going and designing about. So this change order base the approval process was just not limited to the label design. It was much more holistic, much bigger team, and they were in the current process of approving and reviewing everything within the PLM system. So incorporating or putting a new system and just for the labels would have been an overhead rather than being a problem solver. So in order to keep the flow going, because the same set of people would be approving, asking them to go to 2 different systems to approve it, and they had to look the things in totality, not just for the labels. So if they're approving an engineering change order, it basically has other components other than the label templates and the label design. So having a holistic view so that an approver or a reviewer can look everything at one place was the key factor in making a decision that we would keep using the PLM system for reviewing and approving the change order rather than doing it in the PLM, in the Prism 360. And Prism 360 is core focus is on the label part, whereas the PLM is the product lifecycle management tool. So you cannot just have 2 different systems for the same thing. That was the reason.
Okay, thank you for that.
Next question.
Next question here is, can you expand on unattended printing? Who would like to answer that one?
I can take that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jim. Go ahead.
Okay. Unattended printing, as we looked at that slide, we've been talking about using the Prism 360 system. Again, it goes back to what our legacy system looks like. We had a PCS, which is a shop floor control system, which is being used on the manufacturing floor. Replacing that with a new system, a label printing system, was something which was not desired by the manufacturing team or people on the floor. They wanted to keep the process as is. So the integration, we're using the power of the Prism 360 in the background, but we were not actually exposing the front end of the Prism 360 to the user. So doing all the work of collecting the data in the background, whereas you're keeping the front end the same, was basically unattended, means that a user is not logging into the Prism 360 system, but it's doing the same set of tasks had he logged into that. So that's why we call it as unattended printing. And unattended printing is all the data integrity and everything is maintained through these web interfaces, which we talked about, and it's just basically responsible for printing the label once it gets the command to. But the label designing piece is not unattended; it's very much attended, where a label designer logs into the Prism 360 system and does all the good work of designing the labels, dynamic templates, and whatnot. Does that answer your question? Anything?
Okay, thank you for that. That was perfect. Okay, so next question is, Are these real-time integration or batch integration? Who would like to answer that?
I'm not sure. Is that relating to the processing that was described? I'm guessing it probably does, in which case it would be one for you again, I'm afraid, Gian.
Okay, sure. This is, again, all these were the real-time interfaces. There were some of the interfaces which would be a batch, especially like the master data being sent across. But most of these interfaces, especially the printing ones, were real-time, where the data is fetched from the different sources at the runtime during the time of printing of initiate printing transaction. So you could potentially say all these transactions were almost real-time. Next question, please.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so this question is, does Prism 360 require any additional third-party components for integration with SAP or to achieve compliance with, for example, FDA 21, CFR Part 11? Who would like to answer that one?
I think that's probably one for me, Chris. I mean, essentially, no. Prism 360 is the integration with SAP is handled by Prism 360 itself. No third-party components. Of course, you need to have the sockets, if you like, on the SAP side to talk to. So we have to integrate with SAP itself, but that's clearly part of the SAP platform. The compliance part, I mean, the compliance of 360 is kind of built in, or at least the compliance readiness of it. Clearly, customer processes need to be wrapped around it to implement the compliance. But for things like electronic signatures, you know, for Part 11 compliance, etc., then no, those components are part of the platform.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so this question asks, performance of printing. Did you build any performance benchmarks, and how did it measure against the benchmark? Who's best suited to answer that one?
I can take that.
Sorry, Chris.
Okay, so performance.
Go ahead, Jim. Sorry.
From a performance, yeah, no problem. From a performance perspective, there were different parameters which we need to look at it. There were some concurrent printers. There were printing performance parameter, or it could be how many prints can be done per minute. There are other factors which were being looked at and say that what exactly. So we had a benchmark, what we do currently, which was manual. We had a certain benchmarks. We obviously wanted to do something which was better than that. And yes, we did some load testing. We had some scripts were written where we can bombard a particular work order with different number of, let's say, hundreds of labels, and see how does the system respond to that. We did just for particular line prints, but we did not extrapolate it to if you have hundreds of lines running it, because we are still in the process of rolling it out to different lines. So the performance is based on the initial, what we have done seems to meet the standards, but as it gets rolled on to different lines, we'll see how it goes. But yes, we have some tools, we have some scripts in place in order to measure the performance as well as to keep a close track on how the system is performing as far as printing is concerned.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, I see a question here, which is, our strategy is to move away from traditional on-premise applications, and we are migrating to the SAP HANA Cloud platform for our ERP. Can Prism 360 or Prism ID support a cloud-only strategy? Who would like to answer that one?
That's probably one for me there, Chris. Yeah, well, again, the answer in short is going to be yes. Prism 360 is As I mentioned earlier, it's a web-based architecture. It's ideally suited for cloud deployments. It can be deployed on-premise, of course, in the traditional way. It can be implemented into a cloud environment. Be that the customer's preferred hosting platform, or whatever cloud platform the customer wants to deploy it to. But there are also options that are available for having the solution managed in the cloud via a sort of private cloud or hosted approach that Prism ID can also provide. So yes, short answer, yes. Numerous different ways that we can provide support for that kind of strategy. Hopefully that's answered.
Perfect. Thank you. That was perfect. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. We have marked down all the other questions, so not to worry. Someone will get back to you in the near future if we didn't get to answer your question. So that just leaves me to thank Chris and Jan for what was a great presentation, and to thank Prism ID for sponsoring this webinar. To the attendees, you'll receive an email shortly telling you how you can access the on-demand version of this webinar, or you can access this through our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. We look forward to sharing further webinars with you, so please do keep an eye out on the website just mentioned, and follow us on Twitter @BRWebinars for daily updates, and join our LinkedIn group, Business Review Webinars. Thank you once again, and I hope you all have a nice day.